afternoon. It's my great pleasure to chair this panel on strategy in the face of reality. The opening paragraph introducing the theme at this year's Global Peter Drucker Forum asked the question, and it's been asked before, so it's clearly something we're revolving around, is how can strategy be developed and work reliably performed in an age when the pressure and instability are constant and increasing? And so I think we're all feeling this pressure. Today's global business environment is powered by an ever-expanding digital network that is continuously reconfiguring how organizations coordinate, connect, communicate, collaborate, and take collective action. Now, this increased connectivity is bringing a higher level of interdependency and a compounding degree of complexity that frame how the global game of business is being played. Today's business playing field consists of interdependent networks of firms spanning different sectors that consciously orchestrate to create differentiated value. And successfully competing on this playing field requires that players across different industries vie for pools of resources by helping stakeholders with control over those resources achieve a value-added outcome. If you want to execute successful plays on this playing field, you need an approach that visualizes innovation and execution options, enabling real-time shifts as the play unfolds. And you also need leadership that can sense these shifts in the play and apply the best possible decision in near real time. So during this panel discussion, we're going to share the latest research and experience on how organizations successfully adapt within evolving business ecosystems by applying a dynamic, collaborative, and iterative strategic approach to identify and act upon new progression paths to create, deliver, and capture value. In short, if business realities is changing, so too must our approach to strategy. And my esteemed panel colleagues here will tell us how to do just that. To my direct left, Michael Jacobides, Professor of London Business School, Rita Gunter-McGrath, Professor of Columbia Business School, Alex Osterwalder, Entrepreneur and Business Model Innovator, Co-founder of Strategizer, and all the way down to the left, colleague Dory Clark from the Fuqua School of Business. Welcome to you all. So as we think about the global business playing field, Michael, your most recent research has focused on the concept of ecosystems and how we can build advantage through what you call design delight. So would you care to elaborate with the group on what your research has revealed with regards to ecosystems and what we need to know to successfully compete within them?
With pleasure. And it's a great pleasure and honor to be with you this year. Last year, we spoke about value migration and the way in which industries change. What I'd like to do this year is to focus on something a little bit more specific, and it is competing through digitally designed ecosystems. And just to motivate that, for a number of us, the much lamented and prematurely gone device that was our gateway to the world as we were traveling through has given way not to just another device, but to a group of firms that collaborate with it. And the CEO of the other company that was eclipsed by this change, Nokia, just as the ship was going down, sent this email to his employees saying that the battle of devices has now become a war of ecosystems, where ecosystems include not only the hardware and software, but developers, applications, e-commerce, advertising, and that this means that we're going to have to decide how to either build, catalyze, or join an ecosystem. And unfortunately for Nokia, it was too late. Now, ecosystems are important, and I'll show you in a little while a bit of the recent research that tries to measure and contextualize that. But what is an ecosystem? Well, if you go back to the people who are speaking about that, ecosystem has been used as a metaphor, as something that helps us think about everyone that we can connect to. And in one of the first papers in HBR that looks at it, Marco Iansiti and Richard Levien eventually say, well, you know what? Drawing the boundaries of this ecosystem is impossible, and at any rate, academic exercise. Well, a couple of things. The first thing, I am an academic. Second, 2004 is not 2018. And what we have seen is the emergence of well-delineated, orchestrated, strategically managed group of firms that organize together in order to compete. So just the metaphor, however rich and evocative it is, may be misleading. What did we do? Well, part of it is research, and I promise this is the only part of an academic article that I'm going to be putting on screen. It's a paper that was just published on a theory of ecosystems in the Strategic Management Journal, and we looked around and we said, like authors, well, how are ecosystems different? What do they boil down to? Well, tell you what, in the old world, but you'd had things that needed to work together, well, you could do a couple of different things. You either produced all of them and you gave them to the final consumer, or alternatively, what you could have is a system integrator, the IBM of yesteryear, that would take all kinds of bits and pieces, or EDS or Accenture, and say, here, there you have it. It's a solution that is ready from all kinds of components. Or alternatively, the customer would say, well, I'm going to put all the pieces together myself. I'm a grown-up person or firm. I'm able to do that. Well, the challenge, though, is that that doesn't quite work this way with ecosystems that create this perimeter. And in this perimeter, you have a number of different components. So think about the apps that you have in your phone. It's not infinite variety. It's variety that you can actually go and choose. So there's this interesting paradox. Apple and Google don't tell you what you're going to buy, but they tell you how you're going to be circumscribing the bag from which you're actually choosing stuff. And whatever consulting gig you see, you will see that people say, industries are dead, ecosystems will become important. And that's one of the recent McKinsey things that we saw. Now, why is this happening? Well, this is happening because things like the picture that I have behind, which is the guild hall, which is the way that we organize societies in guilds, in things that had exclusionary principles, are just dissolving. And you'll hear from this panel the challenge of people who compete in a world where the industry boundaries are going down. And what you see instead, you don't have architects and doctors and lawyers, but you have people who can support the needs coming from different ways. What does that mean? It means that the patient does not go for a doctor, but to some combination of AI and multiple services that all come together with them. Now, if this is the case, you see why companies are starting to create these digitally enabled connections. Consider what Nest is doing. Nest is not only a venture that measures the temperature in your home and regulates how much you spend, but it also connects with cameras, it connects with the jawbone that you can have, and it can increase the temperature when it senses that you wake up. It creates these links, these ecosystems, these structured set of firms. And these ecosystems come together when they are designed and when the links are specific. Let me give you an example. I told you that ecosystems are about making things that work together. Well, you can think about that as tea leaves, a bag, hot water. That needs to work together. No, we're not going to be speaking about a tea ecosystem. We're not. But think about what Nespresso did, which is to design a specific link to the way that it packages coffee with the people that interface with it. And now it can start saying, do I want to have the machines produce myself? Or do I want to have an open set of relationships where I give some parameters and I say, you guys come and complement me? And that is the element of design that distinguishes much of what we see happening today. Started working with BCG, and we've done research that looks at who uses ecosystems. First of all, this is a graph of all the large companies, over 10 billion, and says how many of them report the term ecosystem. It's been growing. What's more important, the annualized revenue growth of the companies that use ecosystem is markedly different. Now, perhaps you could say, fine, but this is not causation, it's just association. Perhaps. It does show us, though, that there's something there. Now, looking at it, we found a few things, and let me just summarize them. First, we saw that in ecosystems, there are distinct roles. Not only orchestrators, but also partners and contributors who have distinct parts in organizing the way that things are put together. Second, not everyone should try to be build an ecosystem. Not everyone should try to be an orchestrator, and that is one of the most common mistakes of companies who have this fantasy that they will become the Google of their own world. And it's interesting that when you see companies that are responding, companies here that are responding to the threat of Uber, like BMW and Daimler, Mercedes-Benz, rather than trying to create their own luxury mobility ecosystem, they are now joining forces because they realize that in order to reverse the trend. And in order to defend themselves from a vision of the future that is not friendly to them, they need to reorganize things altogether. What do you need to do? Well, your strategy will involve multiple designed ecosystems with multiple roles. One company is going to have a number of different ecosystems with different roles, and we also see companies that are strategically using connections between their ecosystems to create a new generation of synergies, like the ones that we see in Ping An, which using this strategy became the most valuable insurance in the world. A few companies are trying to become mega system integrator, and that is changing the environment for most of us in the room. It doesn't mean that we need to emulate them. It means that we need to think about the strategy for building our own ecosystems or competing in ecosystems. And finally, perhaps the biggest problem that I've seen working with companies that are developing their own ecosystems is that they get a word wrong, because they try to think about their ecosystems. They live in the time before Copernicus, when all the stars are going around them. And rather than thinking about the needs of the clients, developing some true value, and the needs of the complementers, they are simply creating a map around themselves. Doesn't work. What's the agenda? Create a strategy, identify a customer need, understand your complementer need, but also change the organization. Think about the challenges that we've seen working with PCG in a company like Volkswagen that needs to shift from running a simple alliance that it had for 25 years to 40 interdependent links that it has as it tries to shape the future. And the final thing, and it's a slide from the World Economic Forum, where I have the privilege of being the academic coordinator of one of the new task forces in digital platforms and ecosystems, where we're trying to have a discussion on what that means for society. Because unfortunately, these ecosystems transcend national boundaries, and they have created also a world which is much more uneven. Exciting, even if uneven, with challenges on how we run organizations. I couldn't think of a better topic for a meeting such as this. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So, as we think about these ecosystems and competing on this ever-shifting playing field where industry lines are blurring, Rita, your recent research suggests we might need to rethink the nature of competition itself. So would you care to share with the audience your thought on arenas?
I was fascinated by the topic of this panel in terms of strategy meets reality, as this is something I've spent a lot of time working on. And I'm doing some new work on strategic inflection points. So what I want to share with you are three ideas. The first idea is, what's the context in which strategy plays out today? Second idea is, we need to get away from the idea of industry, as Michael's illustrated, and start thinking more about something I call arenas. And the third idea is, how can you as an individual better protect yourself from getting taken by surprise by an inflection point that may have caught you unawares? So those are the three things. So first thing, those of you that know my work know I kind of have seen the death of competitive advantage in many, many parts of our economy. And this particular chart shows market share shifts in the gaming business. In the beginning, there were arcade games. That's all there was. You had to go to a physical place and throw money into this refrigerator-sized machine, and they were expensive and they were complicated. And those gave way to games you could play at home, which was much more convenient. And then eventually we invented games that you could play like on distributed media, like cartridges, tape cartridges, remember those? And then those gave way to games that could be digitized, and today we have games that come with us everywhere, in virtual reality, in our pockets, in our phones, in social media. We have Fortnite, things like that. Now what matters here is not which game won out, what matters is the pattern. And the context in which I see strategic inflection points emerging is this context where an innovation is thought of, takes hold, enjoys its moment, but then something changes and it disappears. And those are inflection points, in my view. So the next idea is that as we see these rapidly changing competitive shifts, we find that the whole concept of industry, which is where strategy used to really be rooted, is much less useful as a mechanism for thinking about competition. So here's an example, a study done by the Wall Street Journal looking at household spending from 2007, when the very first smartphones, as we know them, were commercialized, to 2014. And what they found was spending on things like apparel and cars was going down. Biggest areas of growth, spending on cellular phones and internet to the home. Now, the reason that matters is if you're a traditional strategist and you're benchmarking yourself against other people making apparel, you've lost the plot completely. And so what I think is useful to be thinking about instead is what's the pool of resources that you're contesting? Who are the players that are contesting those resources against you? And what does it mean that your competition really is? So let's take a category of customer, near and dear to our hearts. I was just in Tokyo with Fujitsu at the kind invitation of my colleagues there. And these are teenagers. And think about, to use Clay Christensen and Tony Ulwick's term, what is the job that clothing does for teenagers? Reflect on the teenagers you may know in your life, right? What job does clothing do for them? Well, if you think about it, states who they are, signals belonging to a tribe, signals how they are free from their mom's influence, right? Signals like all these different things that they want to communicate, right? But if you think about it, what are other ways teens could communicate who they are to the communities they care about? If you look at teenagers, they're on their devices nonstop, right? They're communicating, right? And they're sharing and they're talking, and that's what they're doing with their lives. Well, okay, so those devices are probably doing a better job of communicating than clothing could. Let's take that a step further. You're communicating, right, with your friends. You're taking pictures and you're posting them to social media. And it's Monday and you're wearing a blue shirt. And it's Wednesday and you're wearing a blue shirt. And it gets to be Friday and you're wearing a blue shirt in the pictures you're sending around. Well, how lame is that? You know? You don't want clothing that makes you look the same in every post to social media. No, what you want is clothing that lasts for 15 minutes while you get that perfect selfie, and then it goes away again, right? Disposable clothing. And this is an example of a brilliant inflection point. Now think of who has really benefited from this trend, which is known as fast fashion or disposable fashion. Zara, Inditex, right? H&M, with us, Forever 21. It's an ecological disaster. There's starting to be a bit of a backlash, but if you trace it all the way through, you can see why that's happening. And you can see what it does to traditional providers. Like, I think of my mom's definition of quality clothing, right? Totally different than what we are seeing today. So I think there's some really key differences in looking at arenas versus looking at industries. And the main one being, with an arena, you're much more open to what your sources of positional advantage are going to be. So first idea, transient advantage. Second idea, looking at arenas rather than industries. Third idea is, how do you keep yourself from being open to seeing that these things might be changing? You know, if you're Macy's, what should you be paying attention to? And here I want to draw on a concept that was developed by Andy Grove. And he said, you know, snow melts from the edges. So how do you make sure that you're prepared to spot inflections, particularly of the digital sort? And I'll share with you a story of somebody that missed an inflection, which was in retrospect obvious. In New York City, there are these payphones, and there's an organization called Link NYC that thought, fantastic, we're going to replace these payphones with internet kiosks. And this was great, and they rolled it all out, and they stepped back and expected the applause, and what did they find? Like within 48 hours, homeless people were setting up chairs around these internet terminals, and people were like watching porn in Times Square. It wasn't good. And my argument is, it was a lack of diverse perspectives, and you know, maybe they should have consulted somebody who actually knows what goes on the streets of the city of New York. So here's a little checklist. We'll be happy to share the slides with you when we're done. Final thought to remember, you need a new way of thinking. Inflection points are in many cases created by the power of digital, and it can take you to new heights or it can sideline you. So thank you.
Thank you, Rita. So, as we think about making the right strategic plays in an ever-evolving game of business, played on a constantly shifting playing field, it seems that our traditional approach to strategy formulation and execution may no longer fit our reality. And if there's one person I know who travels around the world trying to help companies bring more agility to strategy, it's Alex Osterwalder. And in true fashion, we're all going to cross our fingers because he's got an iPad illustration presentation he's going to engage with us. So may the force be with you, Alex.
He likes to live on the edge.
Let's see if technology works. So good afternoon. We're talking about strategy in the face of reality. So let's start with reality. I want you to discuss for 30 seconds with your seat neighbor how many product and service launches fail. If you have 10 product or service launches in your company, other company, how many of those fail? I want you to figure out what the percentage is. 30 seconds, discuss with your seat neighbor. Let's go.
Software people that kind of have it at 80%.
Yeah,
That's my
that's the
guess.
rate. The data I've seen is like in the 70% range, but
Is that?
70% is what I've seen recently. But
Okay.
you'll have newer data.
Let's do this together. So, the number is actually 7 out of 10 new products or services launched around the world. They flop. So, look around you, 7 out of 10, or 700 people here in the room are working on something nobody wants. Can you put your hand up if you're working on something nobody wants? Put your hand up. A couple of honest people, right? So here's the thing. We could say, I mean, are these people stupid? Is the strategy wrong? What's going on? Well, it turns out, if I can visualize this, now let's see if the technology works. Companies have 2 universes these days. One is about exploiting the business models you have, right? And here, innovation is about efficiency, making better processes. That companies get right, normally. But when it comes to new products and services, when it comes to new business models, we're talking about exploration. This is all about new ideas. So guess what? Uncertainty is much higher. We don't know those customers. We don't know those ecosystems. We don't know those arenas. And we have to admit that when we start out, we have no clue. And if we admit that, we will use different processes to explore these new business models and value propositions. So we've been talking about ambidextrous organizations for a long time. But I think it's time to act because there are actually a lot of business models. If I may just draw something here to illustrate the face of reality, rest in peace, okay? This is a gravestone here, and if you didn't see my drawings, okay? A lot of old business models are expiring. Pharmaceutical industry, business model is dead. Are they ready for the new world? Are they exploring new business models? No. Banking, the old business model is dead. Are we exploring really in a, strong way new business models in banking? No, we're talking fintech. Is technology the problem? No, it's better value propositions and better business models or appropriate business models. So we need to look at these 2 worlds and actually define a strategy for both. So together with my colleague Yves Pigneur, who you might have heard earlier, we came up with a simple tool. Oops, this is wrong. We came up with a simple tool. It's called the portfolio map. You want to look at 2 portfolios to define your strategy. And the first one is your portfolio of existing businesses. Which one is going to die? Which one is going to be disrupted? Which arena is out of fashion? Do we need to look at fashion in a different way? And admit that some of these businesses we need to kill because we want to allocate our resources into new growth engines. It's exactly what Kodak back then did not do. All of their assets were in analog film. Now the story's a little bit more complicated, but because they were so invested in a dying business model, they did not have the right exploration portfolio of new ideas and new directions. But then you might say, well, didn't Kodak invent the digital camera? Yes, they did. So basically, they innovated themselves to death because they innovated technology-wise, which was one of the ideas here, but they didn't come up with the right business models. So what we really want to do here is, and Tim Brown talked about this earlier today, we want to create a lot of alternatives and options that we're exploring with small budgets. And then those that we see that could work, we invest in them. And Rita, you've been talking about options for a very long time. It's time to make this happen in companies. So how many ideas do we actually need, or let's say projects? Ideas are easy. Ideas are free. They're everywhere. The hard thing is turning ideas into value propositions that customers want and business models that can scale. How many projects do I need to invest in to create the next growth engine? So another 30-second conversation with your seat neighbor. If you're running a $10 billion business, how many projects should you invest in to create the next billion-dollar growth engine? Have a 30-second discussion, and then I'll give you the answer, okay? Let's go. How many projects should you invest in? Okay. So, who wants the answer? Who wants the answer to this question? Hands up. Okay, not enough, so I'll finish my talk. Yeah. Who wants the answer? Hands up. Very good. Some of you. You're probably afraid of the answer because it turns out, whoop, wrong direction, you would actually need to invest in 250 projects. Small bets first, right? You start with small bets, and then gradually you filter out those ideas that don't work, not based on a beautiful PowerPoint presentation, but based on evidence from the market. And gradually you will get to those that win. So the big lesson here is that you can't pick the winners. You need to invest in, quotes, the losers. So where do I take this data from? And I'll stop with that, this statistic here. If you look at early stage venture investment, which is a great proxy, 65% of all ideas fail. 25% return a little bit of capital. So you invest 100, you might get 500 back. So where do the outliers come from? It's from a small number. Oh, see if the slides want a technology not with me. Let's see if we can make this work. But it's basically 4 out of 1,000 or 1 of 250. So if you want growth to happen, you need to create the playground, the boundaries for these ideas to emerge. You need to allow people to experiment, have projects in parallel so you can win. That's what strategy is about. And we've heard it a couple of times, creating the conditions for ideas to emerge. It's not, hey, this is a great idea, we make a big bet and we execute. And there are only few companies in the world that have created these conditions. And it's not a miracle, it's not a coincidence that Amazon has grown so quickly. Because when you have a leader who says, we have the best place in the world to fail, Amazon is the best place in the world to fail, and he admits that invention and failure are inseparable twins, you have a completely different culture for those ideas to emerge. And strategy today is a lot more about creating the conditions for the ideas to emerge, for people to work on projects, fail a lot, because some ideas have to fail to have those good ones and those great teams to emerge. That's what strategy setting is about today in a very uncertain world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. So Dory, maybe with the exception of Jeff Bezos, as we think about the role that leaders play today in making the right strategic calls, you suggest that we're all hypocrites when it comes to strategy. On the one side, every leader you talk to says it's incredibly important, and on the other, they say, I just don't have the time for it. So you want to crack the code for us on how we break that particular logjam?
So it turns out that oftentimes, surprise, we don't do what we say we want to do. In fact, we don't do the things that we know we ought to do. There's a quote that I like by the entrepreneur Derek Sivers that said that if more information were all that were needed to be successful, we would all be billionaires with perfect abs. In many ways, that summarizes the situation. There was a study that was done a few years back of 10,000 leaders by the Management Research Group. 97% of them agreed on what the number one factor is in determining a company's success, and that is spending time on the strategic direction. 97%. That's as unanimous as we can possibly get in our culture. And yet, in a separate study that was done by the Strategic Thinking Institute, 96% of leaders, almost exactly as many, 96% of leaders said that they did not have enough time for strategic thinking. So what accounts for this? There's the famous saying, right? We vote with our feet. Don't look at what we say, look at what we do. Why are people, if we claim that strategy is so essential, actually not doing it? Not making that space? Well, you guys are a room full of management thinkers and business leaders. You probably know the reason. It's incentives. And let me suggest to you what those incentives might be and how we can begin to counteract them so we can actually start to do what really is most important. First of all, there are incentives that come from the company. Now, there was a study that was done by Kim Whedon at Cornell University that showed that employees who work long hours, extra hours, 50 plus hours per week, on average were paid 6% more than their colleagues. So we know from demonstrated behavior that companies reward people who put in face time, who put in time at their desks. And you probably also know from your own lived experience that it can be hard with knowledge work, white-collar work, to really determine the quality of people's output sometimes. And so face time, hours at work, become a proxy for productivity and for loyalty. That gets rewarded in our business culture. That's a pretty powerful force. Now the problem, the trick with that is that research has also shown that those are the exact wrong things to be rewarding. At almost exactly that inflection point of working long hours, 50 plus hours per week that you get financially rewarded for, it turns out that is the exact place where your productivity actually starts to decline, according to research done by John Penkoval at Stanford University. Now, what does make you more productive? What does make you more creative, more innovative, if not putting in more time at your desk? Well, research by another pair of Stanford researchers, Apezzo and Schwartz, points to an answer, and that is taking a walk. Actually getting up away from your desk and taking a walk is what is most likely to help you be more productive when you get back to your desk, to have more innovative ideas. But of course, we all know the problem here. It's an optics problem. You look like you're slacking off. Oh, she's the one that's always going off to take a walk. Doesn't look good. And it's not currently what gets rewarded in our corporate life. That's one big challenge when it comes to the incentives that we've set up. Now the other, which is a very hard incentive to fight back against, are the internal incentives, the personal incentives. In 2014, the Oxford English Dictionary added the word crazy. Now you might say, Dory, crazy has been a word before 2014, and indeed it has. But before 2014, it was an adjective. Starting in 2014, it was officially recognized as an adverb, as in crazy busy. You may have heard that phrase, that formulation, which has become more and more ubiquitous in our society. How are you doing? I am crazy busy. People say that over and over again. And why? It's because busyness has become a form of status in our society. It makes us feel important. It makes us feel and seem to the outside world to be important, to be necessary, to be in demand. So there's an internal incentive as well. So what do we do about this? How do we fight back against the forces, company and internal, that prevent us from actually doing what we know, what we state is most important, which is making that time for strategy? I have 3 suggestions, 3 possibilities for you. The first is recognizing and understanding that, frankly, it does not actually take a lot of time to do this strategy work. Sometimes we say, oh, well, when we have more time, when we have a retreat, when I can set aside a day, when I can set aside a weekend, those times almost never come when you are a busy leader. In my book, Stand Out, I interviewed David Allen, the productivity expert. And he had a great phrase. He said, it doesn't take time to come up with a breakthrough idea, it takes space. And what he meant was mental space. We have to willfully shut out for just a moment the emails, the meetings, the demands, and create mental space. But you can have good strategic thinking in the time you have, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. You can make that time. Number 2 is understanding where your time is going currently. I actually embarked earlier this year, and I wrote about it for Harvard Business Review, on a time tracking experiment. During the month of February, I charted every 15 minutes that I spent. I wrote it down at the end of every day so that I could understand how much time I actually was spending on email or in meetings or networking, and see where that time went so you can identify the pockets so that you can build in more time for strategy. And the third and final piece is, in many ways, creating a reframe for yourself about what busyness means. There's another quote by Derek Sivers that I want to close with, and that is, busy is what happens when you're at the mercy of someone else's schedule. We need, in our culture, to shift from a model of busyness means you're important and in demand, to busyness means that you are not controlling your own time. If we make that shift in our own minds, we realize busyness is a choice. We can choose as leaders, as professionals, how and where we want to allocate our time, and even more than that, our mental space. We know strategy is important. Now we have to choose to stop making excuses not to do it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dory. All right, so we've established that in the face of a new business reality, organizations must learn how to survive and thrive within ever-evolving business ecosystems, where the nature of competition shifts from industries to arenas, and the approach to strategy becomes this ongoing evaluation of innovation and execution projects that we move through, and that leadership creates the time and space necessary to make the right calls at the right time. We've also established that these people know a whole lot about strategy in the face of reality, and the Slido is blowing up with a bunch of pent-up questions, so I'm just going to go straight there. First one I think probably Michael and Rita could take a crack at. It says if we buy the arena perspective, that might open up or uncover ecosystem potential. Like outside of fashion, we might see something different where we could still play the resource and capability game. But the question is, so if you can look at it through the lens of arenas, is the ultimate goal, which you and I talked about this morning, Michael, to then become the Uber orchestrator, pun almost intended? Is that the new game in ecosystems? Look through arenas and become the orchestrator. Either one of you comment on that?
Why don't you start?
Well, a couple of things. The first thing is that this is the daydream of almost any board that you would speak. And when they ask you about ecosystems, they say, great, we're going to be the Uber of or the Google of. Which we say, well, forgive me, can we look at reality rather than this idea that we have managed to conquer the hill? I think that what I'd say is that it is a dangerous dream, simply because there's going to be a small number of firms, which is what I call the mega integrators, that use their access to individual customers and their connection to these devices that rule our day in order to be their gateway to the world. So is it extremely powerful to do so? Yes. Have we got a good regulatory framework to think about it? No. Can we actually move from having one small part of your experience to a broader part? Yes, and that is what the strategy of firms like Alibaba and Ping An, actually the firms that are the most expansive are in China, and the reason is that data privacy laws do not constrain them, so they like the idea of expanding once they've got hold of your data. Amazon is trying to do the same thing. You may have read yesterday that Amazon is expanding into healthcare aggressively, as is pretty much any other top firm from the technology space. So I'd say yes, they want to do that. Is it reasonable? I am less convinced. One final thing to note about that, I think that in addition to the changes that we saw in arenas, the other thing that's changing is capabilities, because you are also living in a world where capability developed in one context can now be grafted onto a different context. So I think that this is rewriting the strategy rulebook in fairly profound ways that will affect both what boards do, where is our business, how open or closed are our boundaries, and also operationally, how can I leverage what my business unit is producing, and who is really my competition, and what is the next place that I move to, perhaps even jumping from one arena to the next, which brings us naturally to you, Rita.
So I think the idea of being, the dominant person in an arena is great, but if you've got free markets, your partners have choices. And if you excessively consume the profits and take rents out of the arena that you're participating in, they're going to figure that out pretty quickly. And a great example would be Apple, that has been trying vigilantly for years to do in video what it accomplished in music. And everybody's going, wait a minute, no, we've been down that road once, so we're not doing that again. So I think there's a real need to very carefully think through how to share the rewards of the formation of a particular ecosystem, or I think you're going to find yourself shut out. And I think the players that try to push their advantage too far are going to find that the next round of competition, which is going to come more quickly than we're used to, is going to unseat them.
Can I add something?
No,
to
you're
that?
not
Is
allowed
that
to say anything. Go ahead.
Something that you didn't ask, but I'll answer.
Go on.
So something that Rita emphasized before, I'd just like to bring it up because I think people are not aware enough about that yet. You were saying that industry analysis is dead, right? That was 1985, and I think that's very important, that companies that define themselves as belonging into an industry, they're going to die. You're not in news, you're not in fashion, right? If you do that, I think you're going to die, because today the point of analysis is the business model. I'll give you an example. We mentioned Apple. Okay, which industry is Apple in? Is it hardware? Yeah, that's how they make money. Are they in software? Are they in content? Are they in music? Are they in, they're in all industries, because industry analysis doesn't make sense. It's their business model, or in the case of Amazon, their combination, their portfolio of business models that lets them outcompete others. And the second point is, today you're not a victim of forces, you actually shape forces. So the biggest players today, they created markets. They were not a victim of any force, they were the force. And I think we underestimate that change, and strategy in the face of reality is that if you don't understand that, you're going to die. And there's a huge human cost to that, with layoffs, and so we should avoid that. So I think there's almost like a moral obligation to help established organizations to survive another 100 years. It's easy to say, yeah, they're going to go away, but the human cost of that is enormous. So I do think we need to, in established organizations, transform.
So there's lots of people who completely agree with you, but they've got a lot of questions like, what if I don't have the money to run 250 projects? Like,
of course.
What if the best ideas don't make it through the existing hierarchy because somebody at the top doesn't like it? And is there a way that we can increase that success rate? So if we are going to move forward, right, that data comes from some point in time. Is there hope in actually shrinking the number to get through success through your portfolio model?
I'd say so. I'll keep it short to not take up the space, but I think that number is because we're not innovating the right way today, even in startups. So startups are ahead of established organizations, and actually they're better funded. So I think a lot of startups, you know, they're staying private for long. They can raise up to 100 million and then more, and they're going to kill corporate ventures because corporate ventures are terribly underfunded. So that's one. But if we use the right processes, tools, and the right culture, we can get better at it. So 250 is today. And I had a conversation with Curtis, who's in the crowd, one of the panelists before, and you know, it doesn't have to be that large number. My point is, not every company, not every idea is going to be a winner. That's the most important part to take away, and we need the processes for the winners to emerge. It's not a choice. It's setting the conditions. And this is up for small companies just as much as for large ones, because you start with small funding. $5,000 is enough to explore an idea, and you'll get beyond the PowerPoint presentation and the Excel spreadsheet. That's a fantasy, so we need to get beyond. $5,000, a founding team, that's enough. Doesn't sound like that's inaccessible.
If I can reciprocate the jumping in that Alex did a moment ago, I think that one of the themes that we touched on, though, on this panel is that firm boundaries are changing. And one of the reasons that you see ecosystems form is that there are firms that are able to structure a set of relationships and essentially allow other people to experiment for them and capture a good enough part of the benefit. And I think that one of the benefits of doing that is that you can harness the energy. Now, you do that strategically. You just don't do that randomly, that, oh, open innovation. No. Very strategic, where we open, where we don't. But I think that the skill is, if one were to sort of think about what the difference is, that you don't need to think as a vertically integrated firm that needs to have all these 250. So I might even say that trying to do all of it in-house won't help you as much as being receptive and being able to scale up and absorb ideas that start outside your own boundaries. And some of the solutions that I think that we see emerging on the corporate level facilitate this change of mentality in developing innovation, and the fact that ideation does not need to happen from the firm, but that absorption of ideas is what you need to be working on.
Sure. One more quick point, Michael, is that in addition to drawing ideas from outside the firm, your customers often are the best source of ideas. They will often be asking you either explicitly or implicitly what they want. And so if you develop mechanisms, social media is one, but certainly not the only one, of listening carefully, doing the kind of deep dive ethnographic and anthropological research to understand how people are using your products and the gaps that come when they're trying to use your products, you can often have a kind of quick line of sight into things that might be able to fill in your product lines.
Bingo, and I think that essentially what we have, in the world where you were in the same industry, you can abuse your clients if you were at least as bad as, or roughly as bad as, any other firm. So the problem is that we're now naked. We used to simply need to outcompete our closest competitor, and that was good enough. But unfortunately, with the industry boundaries going down, we need to start listening to the customers, we need to start thinking about the bets, we need to start thinking about the customer needs, we need to think about how we can reorganize and link to ecosystems, which is precisely the force under this transformation that we're seeing, which leads to a managerial transformation and a requirement that we leverage the human potential, which is the topic of the conference as well, in terms of pushing organizations forward.
I think we're hitting something here because we're getting a lot of tension and duality. So there's the question of, Dori, as you mentioned, a lot of times in the design thinking world, we'll kind of be empathic with the customer, and that'll reveal some new insight about a way we can deliver and create value differently. Yesterday, in a panel with Tim and Roger, there was this idea that if you're going to be in an ecosystem type context, and you and I talked a bit about this earlier, Michael, you almost want to understand where your customer's future lies. Not necessarily for a product, but where's insurance going? or banking, insert industry here, if we agree they're collapsing. And then having a shared understanding of that future, building an ecosystem where everybody can contribute to creating a more positive future and also gain from it. Is that naive? Is that where we're going? How does the notion of identity of the corporation manifest itself in the world of ecosystem arenas, portfolios, and leadership that spends more attention focused on that kind of question rather than time focused on what's the answer?
Are you asking me?
I'm asking anybody in the room.
I think firms will still have an identity, and I think this whole conversation we've been having around purpose is very relevant to that identity. I would also say, though, that a lot of firms are still pretty used to having hostages rather than customers. And that, I think, is going to change. And so I think you have to realize that customers today are comparing your experience to the very best experience they get from any player they've ever encountered. And for those that take this seriously with appropriate humility, I think it can be a huge opportunity because they're now much more free to vote with their feet. So I think we're still going to have distinct identities of firms, but their roles are going to be more connected, I would say.
Can I add on that? Because I think the identity is key, but not necessarily just for employees, but to know which choices to make. So I think defining the playground, what's in, what's out. Okay, so why can Amazon do Amazon Web Services? Because all the analysts said, you can't do that, that's stupid, you're an e-commerce firm. But when you have a company that says, no, we're about growth, we're going to invest in growth all the time, and we're going to pick opportunities where we have either a synergy with the existing business, or the market, can grow as large as the one we're already addressing. That is the playground that's defined. So Amazon's identity is about growth. And then there's some other parts that we might not want to talk about, but really defining that playground. And a wonderful example is Unilever with Paul Pullman, who's going to speak as well, right? Because they've clearly communicated that identity to shareholders.
Right.
Because shareholders are the owners. So you need to have this communication. Now everybody knows what Unilever is about. That's what you're buying when you buy Unilever shares. That's what you do when you work there. When you innovate, you know what's in, what's out. Is it environmentally sustainable? That's in. Is it not? That's out. You need to define the identity.
Well, since you spoke about playgrounds, let me give you sort of one imagery of what it is that I see firms are starting to move towards. We used to have a world where toys were delimited. You have doll houses, you have trees. They could only do one thing. And we're moving to toys that are Lego blocks that can build a toy house, but also build a spaceship and also build a tree. And if you think about the most profound impact of artificial intelligence is that it gives generic blocks and it provides the opportunity to companies that are thinking about how they're going to be colonizing with the skills that they build the world in a different way. Take a look at the evolution of markets that Amazon and Google in particular, has gone, and you'll see what I mean. I also think that as we look at what companies do, and if we think about the process by which they move, you see that customer centricity combines with an understanding of firms. So I was, last week we were speaking over dinner with the Chief Innovation Officer of Ping An. And I was asking him, so Jonathan, how do you think about the evolution of your business? And I think that what you would hear from them is, well, I try to think about what are the needs that the customers have that are roughly proximate to us technologically and that are being poorly served. And I try to imagine how we can create an extension of what we do or take some of the skills of what we do and populate that world, not only vertically integrating, but also creating these ecosystems. So I think that the changes in the mentality of how we evaluate what we have as a firm and ultimately how we're organized is going to make a difference and is going to change the nature of the game moving forward.
Cool. So
I just wanted to jump in briefly. A couple years back, I wrote a book about professional reinvention at the individual level called Reinventing You. And there was a woman that I profiled in the book who was a lawyer who decided, she was a legal scholar, and she decided she didn't want to do that anymore. And she ended up reinventing herself to become a consultant in the wine industry. And one of the key parts of that is that If you just looked at her resume, being a lawyer or a legal scholar, it was the only thing she was qualified for. She'd spent 10 years in this doctoral program, got her JD, got her PhD, and there was no other option for her. But if you peel back one layer and you don't just look at the job title, you look at the skills and you look at the abilities. Well, she was a good public speaker and she was good at sales, she was good at persuasion, she knew multiple languages. And that enabled her to see the potential where she could become a consultant to foreign vintners who wanted to break into the US market. And I think that in many levels, it's the same transformation that companies need to do strategically. You can't just stick to the title. You can't just stick to the industry. To your point, Rita, you have to look at the arena. You have to peel back the layers and say, okay, maybe it's not this field per se, but we do have skills, we do have abilities. How can we apply them elsewhere?
Okay, I'm getting the hook. So my last question, and it's one word. If there was one word you want us to consider deeply as we wrestle with strategy in the face of our own business reality, what would that word be, Dory? One word.
Choice.
Choice.
Busyness is a choice, and strategy is a choice.
Alex?
Hope.
Hope. We talked about that last night. Rita?
Assumptions.
Assumptions. Michael?
Agility.
Agility. Please join me in thanking our panelists for sharing their words of wisdom with us. Thank you so much.